In Islam, it is prohibited for Muslims to depict images of the Prophet Muhammad. There are several artworks where Muhammad's face is covered, and it makes you wonder what Muhammad really looked like. If you enter a mosque, Muhammad's name will be written in calligraphy, but there will never be an image of him. Muhammad's teachings are at the core of Islam and are practiced by over 1.9 billion Muslims. He is clearly a very influential figure in the world today. So, what did Muhammad look like, and how do we know? To answer this question, we should examine all the historical evidence for his appearance. The best evidence for Muhammad's appearance derives from several key sources, all dating back to the early Islamic period. This is around 600 AD, as Muhammad was born in the year 570 and died in 632. The most important of these is al-Shama'il al-Muhammadiyya, a collection of hadiths that record details of Muhammad's life and what he looked like. For the record, in Islam, a hadith is a collection of sayings of the Prophet Muhammad that acts as the major source of guidance for Muslims. While Muhammad was operating and spreading Islam during his lifetime, devout Muslims would transmit what Muhammad's life was orally, and over time, scholars began collecting and recording these stories. Interestingly enough, the Quran does not contain descriptions of Muhammad's physical appearance. While the Quran is the sacred text of Islam, it does mention Muhammad by name and describes his character and some of his spiritual qualities. It really does not provide anything about what he looked like. Instead, detailed descriptions of Muhammad's appearance come from the Islamic Hadith and reports from his companions that knew him personally. The most detailed descriptions come from individuals who had direct contact with the Prophet himself. The first is Ali ibn Abi Talib, Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law. In the Al-Shama'il al-Muhammadiyya, he described Muhammad by saying that he was neither excessively tall nor short, but rather was of medium stature among his people. His hair was neither extremely curly nor straight, but rather it was wavy and flowy. He was neither corpulent nor was his face completely circular, but it was slightly rounded. His complexion was fair with some redness. His eyes were very black and his eyelashes were long. His joints were large and his shoulders broad. He was smooth-skinned. A thin line of hair ran from his chest to his navel. His hands and feet were full-fleshed and sturdy. He walked with vigor, as though descending from a height. When he turned to look at someone or something, he would turn with his whole person. Between his shoulders was the seal of prophethood, and he is the seal of the prophets. Ali ibn Abi Talib likely wrote this during the years 610 to 661. This dates perfectly during the time of Muhammad. To many historians, this source is considered credible because it was likely written when Muhammad was alive. There are even more descriptions that help us understand Muhammad's appearance. We have the description of Hind ibn Abi Khalal, Muhammad's other stepson, from 622 AD. It says, "The messenger of Allah was imposing and majestic. His face shone like the full moon. He was somewhat taller than medium height and a little shorter than what could be described as tall. His head was large and he had hair that was neither curly nor straight. If his hair parted, he would leave it parted, and it did not go beyond the lobes of his ears if he allowed it to go long. He was very fair-skinned with a wide brow and had thick eyebrows with a narrow space between them. He had a vein there which throbbed when he was angry. He had a long nose with a line of light over it, which someone might unthinkingly take it to be his nose. His beard was thick and full. He had black eyes, firm and high cheeks, a wide mouth, and white teeth with slight gaps. When reading this account, we must remember that during Muhammad's time, Arab men were roughly 167 to 170 centimeters tall. For this reason, there is a good chance that Muhammad was roughly 5 feet and 6 inches tall, given that this was average height at this time. We have even more accounts that describe Muhammad's appearance. We have a recording from Mabad al-Khuzaiyyah, a nomadic woman, who encountered Muhammad briefly during his migration to Medina. She provided a poetic and detailed description to her husband and said, "I saw a man, pure and clean, with a handsome face and a fine figure. He was not marred by a skinny body, nor was he overly small in the head or neck. He was graceful and elegant, with intensely black eyes and thick eyelashes. There was a huskiness in his voice, and his neck was long. His beard was thick, and his eyebrows were finely arched and not joined together. When silent, he was grave and dignified, and when he spoke, glory rose up and overcame him. He was from afar the most beautiful of men and the most glorious, and close up he was the sweetest and the loveliest." Once again, these descriptions must be read in the context of their time. If a source states that Muhammad's neck was long, for example, it is long for that particular period. This distinction is important because human physiology tends to change over time, and we need to consider the context of each recording. While many non-Islamic sources mention Muhammad, they do not do a great job at describing his appearance. For these reasons, scholars focus on the previous 3 accounts to understand what Muhammad looked like. So based on these eyewitness accounts, we can say Muhammad had the following physical features. When it comes to his height, we can describe him as medium, sturdy, with broad shoulders and a chest. He had large joints, and his stomach never protruded beyond his chest. When it comes to his face, it was round, and he had a fair complexion with a rosy tinge. His face glowed and was compared to the full moon when he was happy. With respect to his hair and beard, his hair was black, slightly wavy, reaching his earlobes or sometimes even his shoulders. His eyes were very black or even very dark, with long, thick, curved eyelashes. His hands were exceptionally soft and often compared to silk. Eyewitnesses consistently reported a remarkable natural fragrance that perhaps Muhammad had. He was not particularly hairy, apart from a thin line of hair running from his chest to his navel, and he also had some hair on his forearms. We also know that he walked briskly with long strides, leaning forward as if he was descending a slope. These physical descriptions of Muhammad were systematically preserved through hadith transmission. In Islam, a hadith involves 2 parts. The first is the matn, which is the actual text or the content of the hadith itself, and secondly, there is the isnad, which is the chain of narrators who transmitted the hadith from Muhammad through successive generations until it was collected in written form. The chain of hadiths require that every single narrator in the chain must have directly heard the hadith from the person preceding them. For this reason, no gaps or missing chains are allowed. The chain must form an unbroken link that extends from the Prophet back through his companions and through to future generations. So, when it comes to hadiths concerning Muhammad's appearance, the descriptions appear in multiple independent sources that agree with each other. Most historians therefore think that these hadiths that describe Muhammad's appearance are reliable eyewitness accounts. Once again, in Islam, the depiction of Muhammad is generally prohibited. The reason is to prevent idolatry and to maintain respect for religious figures. For Sunni Muslims, they avoid images of Muhammad, believing that representing the Prophet physically could lead people towards worshipping the Prophet instead of Allah. In the eyes of Islam, that is considered shirk, which is a serious sin. While the Quran does not explicitly ban images, many hadiths strictly forbid creating images of prophets. Nevertheless, scholars have debated the historical reliability of the hadith. Some scholars question whether these accounts are accurate eyewitness accounts from the 7th century. The most fundamental concern, however, is the massive scale of hadith fabrications in early Islamic history. There were fabrications created to support political groups and also to attack enemies. After the Prophet's death, conflicting political and theological ideas incentivized the creation of false words and deeds attributed to Muhammad. This became so widespread that Muslim scholars themselves acknowledged it and created an entire methodology called hadith criticism. The purpose of hadith criticism was to combat fabrications. Now, this raises a foundational question. If fabrication was so common that only roughly 1% of hadiths were deemed authentic by the early collectors, how are we supposed to distinguish what genuine hadith recordings were from forgeries? This raises skepticism when reading the hadith and, of course, when reading hadiths concerning Muhammad's appearance. However, the description of Muhammad's physical appearance are generally considered the more reliable hadiths because, number one, they contain mundane details with no real reason to be fabricated. Two, there are multiple independent sources that agree on the appearance of Muhammad. Three, the accounts come from individuals who had intimate daily contact with Muhammad. And four, contemporary and non-contemporary Muslim sources confirm Muhammad's existence and activities in the early 7th century, providing a strong historical framework for these accounts. At the same time, there are still some limitations. Firstly, these descriptions of Muhammad are written and are therefore not physical evidence. We do not have DNA, skeletal remains, contemporary portraits, or even forensic data to truly determine what Muhammad looked like. Nevertheless, critical scholars like Patricia Crone and Fred Donner, who question many traditional Islamic narratives, still believe that Muhammad was a real person and that the early descriptions from the Muslim communities are quite accurate. The physical descriptions are relatively mundane and seem to be quite consistent across different sources, and for this reason they're generally considered more reliable than miraculous claims of Muhammad or larger theological claims. You may be wondering why the appearance of Muhammad is important for Muslims. Well, in Islamic theology, Muhammad is considered the final prophet and the ideal human exemplar. Knowing his appearance allowed believers to visualize him during prayers and worship practices. The companions, the people who wrote down these details of Muhammad, had a deep affection for him, and it motivated them to remember and transmit every detail about him, from major teachings to minor physical characteristics. Since Islam generally discouraged making images that could lead to idolatry, verbal descriptions became the primary means of visualizing the Prophet. While scholars continue to debate the historical accuracy of these hadiths, they undeniably reflect how Muhammad's earliest followers remembered him and described him. But that brings us to the end of this video on what Muhammad looked like. I hope you found it interesting and developed some idea of what the Islamic prophet would have looked like if you were wandering around during the early Islamic period. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing and liking the video for more educational content like this.